Ministerial statement, Minister for Home Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, sir, on the 7th of March 2019, the government cancelled the permit for a concert due to be performed by Watain. 8 days later, on 15th of March, a white man shot, killed 50 people, all Muslims, in 2 mosques in Christchurch. 3 days after that, on the 18th of March, a man of Turkish origin shot and killed 3 people in the Netherlands. 5 days after that, on the 23rd of March, ISIS's last stronghold fell. 4 events, 4 countries, 16 days. All 4 tell us how different societies deal with race and religion. Is there a larger picture showing interconnections among the 4 events? I will suggest to this House that there is such a larger picture with possible lessons. Sir, hate speech, racial religious harmony. This is an issue of considerable consequence to our society. I therefore propose to make a ministerial statement, and it is important that we hear MPs. I will move a motion later for my statement to be considered by Parliament, and that will allow MPs to speak on the statement. I hope that we can reach some level of clarity, agreement on how we should frame, apply our rules on speech so as to maintain racial, religious harmony. But one point to note as a matter of record, regulation of content of entertainment in general is one of MCI's important functions. Ensuring, amongst other things, that we deal with hate speech to prevent conflict, violence between people of different races, so as to maintain internal security is one of my ministry's core functions. My ministry as a whole, ISD in particular, spend a lot of time on this. So my speech will focus on this latter aspect, hate speech, racial, religious harmony. I will cover the following areas. First, I will deal with what hate speech is, examples of hate speech, for a political leader calling members of a racial religious group vermin that needs to be exterminated. I will share, using research in neuroscience, how hate speech interacts with the brain, how logic and reasoning are ineffective. Second, I will touch on the experience of other countries, how they have attempted to deal with hate speech. And third, I will discuss offensive speech as opposed to hate speech and our approach towards it. Fourth, I will discuss the Christchurch shooting and the lessons we can learn from it. And fifth, I will discuss specifically the cancellation of the Watain concert. Sixth, I will deal with the arguments that have been made against our approach in dealing with offensive speech. And finally, I will discuss the role of social media in propagating hate speech. So with your permission, can we display some slides on the LED screens? I think this has been discussed, some specific slides. So as a first proposition, I assume and certainly hope there will be unanimous agreement in this House that we must preserve racial, religious harmony in Singapore. Assuming we do, then we have to consider, first, the degree to which hate speech can impact on racial and religious harmony. Second, the steps that should be taken to deal with hate speech. Third, the continuum between hate speech and speech which is offensive on race and religion. There is an overlap between the two. So what do we do about offensive speech? So let me start with hate speech. It's been defined as all forms of expression which spread, incite, promote, or justify racial hatred, xenophobia, other forms of hatred based on intolerance. It can fall into different categories in different platforms. For example, religious hate speech can be very powerful. Political hate speech can be very powerful, especially if the politician is charismatic. It can be in general discourse, in the mass media. It can be as part of entertainment, like music, theater. This list is illustrative. It is not intended to be exhaustive. What impact can hate speech have? With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I've asked the Clerk of Parliament to place handouts on the seats with various tabs so that I don't need to read out some of this stuff. And if you look at tab 1, hate speech leads to social divides. Repeated hate speech increases people's prejudices, feelings of being threatened, propensity to violence. How does it do so? Hate speech desensitizes individuals. It normalizes behavior which we would otherwise consider unacceptable. It stokes anger and fear. It provides a surge of stress hormones. It engages the amygdala, the brain center for perception of threat. Once that is done, it's harder for people to control their emotions, think before they act. People don't have to be extremists to be moved to violence by incendiary rhetoric. Studies show that just about any person could be susceptible under the right conditions. A psychologist from Princeton has shown that distrust of an outgroup linked to anger and impulses towards violence against that group. Most people are moral creatures. So you picture morality as being in gear. At times, it can get disengaged and get to neutral. Morality can get disengaged when we redefine our actions as honorable, and we believe that what we are doing is a matter of honor. We believe the victims are deserving of their punishment. They are an outgroup and not quite human. Dehumanization then takes place. Distrust and contempt against the outgroup can be built up. Neuroimaging studies show that you then don't think of these people as social beings. So the lesson is that when hate speech is systematically developed, it becomes socially acceptable to discriminate and to oppress. So the important lesson is that civilization must intervene early to prevent hate speech from becoming normalized. Once it is normalized, dehumanization of the outgroup is very difficult to reverse. Let me set out some real-world consequences of hate speech. Of course, a classic and extreme example is the Holocaust, how hate speech was used to mobilize an entire population to commit terrible crimes. Jews were considered vermin by Nazi Germany, requiring fumigation by the Aryan state. Rwanda is another example. In 1994, 800,000 were killed. A Hutu mother beat to death a child who lived next door because the government had told her Tutsis were her enemies, even as the child was looking at her with its innocent eyes, and they had grown up next door to each other. She justified the slaughter as doing a favor to the child, or because it had already been orphaned because the parents had been killed. You have Pakistan, the concept of honor, shame involved. If you are a true Muslim, a hero, then you will be a person who has the courage to defend Islam and the Prophet, by killing Kafirs. And that happened to the former governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer, who was assassinated by his own security officers because he took positions which were considered against Islam. You have Sri Lanka, where the Buddhist priests painted a picture of Buddhism as being under threat and promoted hate and violence. The group's leader, Gnanasara Thero, suggested that halal certification is an evil conspiracy, spreading across the island in various guises, casting its dark shadow. So one could ask, what do these countries have to do with Singapore? Sri Lanka was ahead of Singapore in most indices in the late 50s. We went there to study their systems. Why is it that religious leaders in Singapore don't say these things? It's not preordained. In fact, in Singapore, even the population opposes religious leaders saying these things. I'll show you a survey which shows that. But why is that so? It's because of our laws, and over the last 54 years, we have done many things to try and build a society based on mutual respect and harmony. You know what happened in Myanmar? Hate speech directed at the Muslim Rohingyas. Leader of one of the movements has called mosques enemy bases, urged Buddhists to boycott Muslim businesses and not have interfaith marriages. When you have this situation, logic, reason will not work because an entire architecture of hate has been built up. The hateful emotions have been engaged. Marketplace of ideas does not work in these circumstances. In 2018, 2 PhD students did a study in Warwick University. They showed that hate speech triggered hundreds of violent crimes against refugees in Germany. But they also saw a pattern. You take a place where you can expect to see crimes against refugees. In fact, there have been crimes against refugees. But where hate speech becomes limited for a period of time, the violence decreased sharply. Germany's Federal Ministry of Interior's 2015 report says uninhibited hate speech on the internet can lead to individual or collective radicalization. I'm not going to read all of it, it's on the screen. But it makes the point, hate speech creates a pressure to take immediate action, and it creates fertile soil for militancy and violence. The rest of it is on the screen. Let's look at songs which spread hate. Studies have shown that music can create powerful emotions in the listener. Listening to violent music stimuli, even without lyrics or videos, can cause greater aggression than listening to no music at all. Songs have been a very powerful medium for spreading hate speech. Hate music has been used to label, devalue, persecute, scapegoat particular groups of people, often minorities. White racialists use white power music too. They use it to deny humanity of African Americans. In fact, the way African Americans are dehumanized is to depict them in drawings, stereotypical physical features, which robs them of their humanity, and then through music as well. There's some examples of lyrics. It's on the screen. I don't want to read it out, partly because of the language. You look at references to niggers running amok. You can't come out here anymore because now you're faced with a nigger foe. And a lot more not mentionable, not least in Parliament. In the 1990s, there was a study of skinheads in the US to determine factors that were able to distinguish terrorist skinheads from non-terrorist ones. White power music was found to be important to the construction of the identity of the terrorist skinheads. Approximately 91% of terrorist skinheads limited their music consumption to white power bands. German government has described skinhead music as the #1 gateway to violence. Members may have heard of the Malay Power Music Festival in Malaysia. Malay Power movement believes that Malaysia should be an exclusively Malay nation, immigration should end, non-Malays should be expelled. A Malay Power band says this, and I quote, "The lesson that we can learn from Nazism is that we can take extreme racist action if the position of the Malays is affected by these factors." Just across the causeway. A music fest featuring Malay Power nationalists called Rebellion Fest was cancelled just this month in Malaysia. So it's all around us. And there's nothing special about us that these things can't happen here. In summary, hate speech denigrates the outgroup and says the outgroup is the source of the problems, dehumanizes the outgroup, making violence against them justified. The Christchurch killings were motivated by white supremacist ideology. White supremacist graffiti covered the attackers' rifles. The Prime Minister of New Zealand has called for a global fight against right-wing extremists. Meanwhile, Islamic militant groups are using the Christchurch attacks to push a message of hate that the West is at war with Islam. So what should we do about this? Before we look at Singapore, it is useful to look very briefly at how some other countries have dealt with hate speech. If you look at the US, speech, it's a very high threshold. Before you can prohibit speech, it must be directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. So it must both be of such a nature as to produce imminent lawless action, and it is likely to incite the production of such action. It's a very, very high threshold. So even speech advocating violence by the Ku Klux Klan is protected under their free speech rules. So you see speeches which are anti-Semitic, speeches which denigrate the African Americans, the Hispanics, politicians who denigrate religions, ethnic groups. So one example is Steve King, a US congressman. He has praised Mr. Wilders from Netherlands, who has in turn called the prophet a pedophile, a mass murderer, a terrorist, and madman, and has said the Quran is worse than the Mein Kampf, and has called for the closure of mosques. So Steve King praises him. In Europe, some countries, there are broader prohibitions than the Americans. 2018, the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, gave an important decision. The Austrian courts had convicted a lady who had called the Prophet Muhammad a pedophile. She appealed. The ECHR ruled that the conviction did not violate her freedom of expression. It did not extend that far. They said the right to freedom of expression has got to be balanced against the right of others to have their religious feelings protected. The German Criminal Code criminalizes incitement of hatred against or insult of a racial religious group. Same section also criminalizes the glorification of Nazi rule. So just note, in the German Criminal Code, it covers insults, which is not quite, or which may not quite be hate speech, but could be offensive speech. And I'll come back to this later. In the UK, it is a crime to incite hatred on the grounds of religion. But you can, in the UK, ridicule, insult, abuse any religion, beliefs, practices, or the followers of such religions. So in the UK in 2018, more than 1/4 of all Britons, that's more than 12 million people, witnessed hate speech. Majority were on social media, involved anti-immigrant, anti-refugee language, racist abuse, anti-Muslim comments. So the UK now finds itself fighting on two fronts: right-wing extremists as well as Islamic extremists. Security services are investigating a possible contact between the Christchurch gunman and the right-wing extremists in the UK. And the UK's lead anti-extremism commissioner has said, and I quote, "Frightening amount of legal extremist content is available online, fueling far-right activism." At one point, a preacher, Abu Hamza, was Britain's most high-profile hate preacher. He was finally convicted in 2006 for soliciting murder, inciting racial hatred in his inflammatory sermons. He had been preaching since 1997, 10 years. In his sermons, he described Jews as the enemy of Islam. He told followers to bleed the enemies of Islam. They should not rest until they have created a Muslim state. Britain, of course, has an admirable long tradition of free speech. You argue different positions, you get clarity. But hate speech like this, targeting ethnic, religious communities, does not appeal to logic. It's not capable of being rebutted by logic. The intention is that the recipients of hate speech should be filled with hate, and they are turned into hate machines in the false belief that God requires that. How does logic and open debate counter this? So Britain's lax approach attracted a lot of people like Abu Hamza, who went about spreading the message of hate. And London became a center for many of these hate mongers. Finsbury Park Mosque, where Abu Hamza preached, has been described as a global magnet for militants from late 90s to up to 2003. The attendees included Richard Reid, the shoe bomber, for whom you can thank for having to take off your shoes each time you go past in an airport. Zacharias Musawi, one of the 9/11 attackers. So in New Zealand, shortly after the Christchurch incident, New Zealand's chief censor banned the shooter's manifesto, The Great Replacement. The basis for the banning is that the manifesto tries to inspire murder and terrorism. That has now led to a debate. Oh, free speech is being curtailed. Usual arguments. Better to trust people to form their own conclusions than suppress hate speech altogether. The shooter himself confessed he developed his views from the internet. He said, "You will not find the truth anywhere else." The conclusion he formed, kill as many Muslims as possible. The UN last month, February 2019, the UN Secretary General called hate speech a menace to democratic values, social stability, peace. Pointed out the dangers of allowing hate speech to move into mainstream. He said, with each broken norm, the pillars of humanity are weakened. He has assigned a team to scale up the response to hate speech and present a global plan of action on a fast-track basis. We are told regularly we should be more like the US or the UK, the gold standards for free speech, but their experience suggests that serious consequences can follow when you are lax about hate speech. Now, what is our experience? Our experience recognizes that race and religion are fault lines. They are gut issues. They can be very emotive. If you go to a 2016 survey by CNA-IPS, race and religion play a large role in personal decisions of Singaporeans. If people feel that their race, religion is under attack, the potential for violence increases. If I can quote Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, "No amount of troops," and you can see the quote there, so I don't even need to read it, "no amount of troops would be able to stop the trouble if there was real hatred between the different communities." We prohibit hate speech. We also take quick action when there is hate speech, and the speaker will be advised to stop. ISD will take action depending on the severity of what has been said and the possible consequences. Of course, the person who conceptualized, crystallized our approach is the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. In 1999, reflecting back, he said this. I'm not going to read it. It's tab 3 in what we have handed out. He talked about having done the easier part, getting people into housing estates, schools, putting them together. How it will be much more difficult to get people to accept each other, and that it just takes one mishap. And he talked about fault lines, how it's going to take a long time, 20, 30, 40 years, to work on this, and why we need to find common ground, tolerant, accommodative, take a multiracial, multilingual, multi-religious, multicultural approach, and that one race or religion does not foist itself on another. The full quote is with you. PM Lee, in 1987, also set out our approach. That's tab 4 in your bundle. And so I will not read all of it out, but he pointed out the most straightforward way to destabilize Singapore is to have racial and religious discord. And he said, never assume that free and open discourse will magically lead to truth and enlightenment. Members will recall what I said earlier about logic not coming into play in this situation. He referred to the 1950 riots, the 1964 riots, the 1969 riots, and the Singapore government's unwavering commitment in pursuing multiracial policies, taking action against chauvinist agitators. And he said, and this is an important line, in race, we come up against atavistic human instincts, which will take generations to overcome. They can be whipped up. And once blood has been shed, the years of nation building we have done will come to naught. The experience of other countries shows when you are clear, you have firm laws prohibiting hate speech, you deal fairly with all communities, then you can start building a multiracial, multireligious, harmonious society. I hope there will be agreement in this House that hate speech, whatever form it takes, religious, political, entertainment, in all its different forms, is unacceptable. And we should continue to prohibit hate speech and deal with it firmly in the way we have done so far. That brings me to my next point. How should we deal with offensive speech? Speech does not fall into neat categories: hate, non-hate, offensive. It's a continuum, a spectrum. There can be acceptable commentary on race and religion, offensive speech, and hate speech. Offensive speech can segue into hate speech, and they overlap, obviously. If you refer back to the definition of hate speech, which I gave earlier, it covers offensive speech. And remember the German criminal code, which covers insults. At the same time, there may be factual observations which are necessary. For example, in a multiracial, multi-religious society, sometimes you have to speak frankly about the issues facing one community or another, and to focus on the issues and to try and find solutions. There may be a need to point out the differences between the races for a variety of public policy reasons. That sort of speech is necessary, unavoidable. I'm not referring to that here. The point is, should we allow offensive speech in general mainstream discourse, even if it is not hate speech? Say, for example, you can regularly in public discourse, including theater, songs, politics, religion, you can joke, you can insult, you can laugh at, denigrate people of another race, another religion. What do you think will happen? Take offensive theater. The ventriloquist, Jeff Dunham, US. His puppets include Jose, the Mexican immigrant, Ahmed, the dead terrorist. You can imagine what he will do with these. Peddles in offensive views of various races and women, performs to sell out crowds in America. He's one of the highest paid comedians in the world. Audience mainly white Americans. Members may remember a lady, Amy Chong, who made nasty comments about Malays, their weddings in white decks. You can see it on the screen. I'm not going to read it out. You can see how offensive and repulsive it is. If this sort of expression becomes common in public discourse, what happens? If we normalize offensive speech, after a while, the tone, texture of public discourse will change. Giving offense to others will become normalized. Offensive speech in the long run can also lead to dehumanization. There is emerging work in the field of neuroscience that if an individual observes another member of his own species experiencing pain, he would experience non-conscious neurostimulation, which leads to empathy. But such empathy is only triggered when the person is part of your in-group. Offensive speech, which implies that the target lacks morals, lacks intelligence, lacks dignity, in fact, is even more insidious. Because listeners may get a false sense that they are not internalizing these sorts of descriptions because they are funny. But you are being drip-fed the notion that the outgroup is stupid, ignorant, immoral, sinful, and ultimately leading to dehumanization. When you think of them as subhuman, therefore you may no longer be bound by moral constraints. Subconsciously, the brain won't feel empathy for them. It's a slower process compared with hate speech. Hate speech moves on turbocharge. Offensive speech is on the same trajectory, but slower. It can take time, but end result is the same. So if you look at our pledge and the ideals, we, the citizens of Singapore, pledge ourselves as one united people, regardless of race, language, and religion. How can we be one united people when every day it is accepted that one race or another, one religion or another, can be publicly insulted, ridiculed, and attacked? Over time, effect will be felt in every aspect of life. Schools, jobs, neighborhoods, politics, environment will be conducive for discrimination, eventually violence. That is why we have restrictions on offensive speech, even when it is strictly speaking not hate speech. And this is an important point, and I hope this is a point on which members in this House can agree. Some people ask me, what's the purpose of this motion, because they think that at the end of it, we must have some legislation. No. This is a debate simpliciter. We set out our approach. We set out what has guided our approach. We want to hear the MPs because it is important for the next generation of Singaporeans to understand a bit of the history, to see what the ideals are, and how we should go forward. And if people want the approach to be changed, then we should hear it in the House, and that will educate the young people one way or the other. So it's important that we have a proper discussion. That's the only purpose of this debate and motion. The question is, if we agree that there must be restrictions on offensive speech, then the question is, what should be the extent of the restrictions? On this, do we think that Singaporeans are sui generis, that unlike others, we will not engage in offensive speech, hate speech, because that's our inherent nature? Do we believe that? If we had not tried so hard for so long to keep it under check through laws and work very hard on racial and religious harmony, will we have the situation we have today? Let me give you a few examples. This is in tab 5 of your bundle. In 2009, a couple was charged for distributing highly offensive material on the Prophet, on Islam, and they sent it to Muslims. Nicholas Lim, young man, he made a post by reference to Malays, can cabs carry uncaged pets? Benjamin Koh, he made another posting, Muslims are pigs, mosques are brothels, displayed a pig's head picture on the halal look-like logo. Gan Hui Shi, Malays are rodents, ridicule pilgrimage to Mecca. And of course, Amy Chong again. She was a Malaysian residing in Singapore. I can give you other examples, but I can also say, thankfully, it's much less in Singapore, much, much less in Singapore compared with other countries. Most people will think this sort of speech is unacceptable. And again, why have we not had the levels of such speech that you find in other countries? Our position so far has been very practical, very nuanced. We take the view that offensive speech should generally not be allowed in public discourse. And the current legal framework, I'm not going to go into it, but the Penal Code, sections 298, 298A, the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, section 8, the Sedition Act, sections 3 and 4, set out the legal framework. But as I've said repeatedly, the legal framework just is the legal framework. You've got to work with people to also internalize in day-to-day living the lived reality of Singaporeans. This legal framework, however, requires us to assess inter alia the impact of the offensive words on the feelings of the targeted groups. And how do we approach it? We approach it this way. First, we look at the words, the material. How offensive are they? Second, we look at what is the likely impact of the speech. How would, for example, the community, which is a target of the offensive speech, react? In this context, let me make one point clear again. I'm speaking about offensive speech in relation to race, religion, and in the context of preserving racial, religious harmony, preventing unrest, violence. In a broader context, material may be offensive for other reasons, social mores, values, child abuse, and so on. The regulation of content in the broader context is handled by IMDA. MHA deals more narrowly with prevention of violence, the security aspects arising from offensive speech, and directed at racial and religious divides. So let me now deal with these 2 points. First, we look at the words themselves. Are the words in themselves derogatory, offensive, insulting to a particular race or religion? I've given various illustrations of offensive words. Again, I really do not want to read them out. It's in tab 6, Amos E, for example, talking about the Muslim community. It's tab 6 in the handouts that you have. They follow a sky wizard. They are dumb. He is a pedophile. And he gives a four-letter description of Christians, describes Buddhists, Taoists. Of course, the US has given him asylum. We're quite happy about that. If you want illustrations of offensive lyrics, again, I don't need to read them, but it's in tab 7, and it's also on the screen. You have Hosea, which take me to church. You know, I'll worship like a dog at the shrine of your lies, and so on. You can see there's plenty of material all around. So what's the second factor that we consider? What is the likely impact of the speech? Who says it? It has more salience, for example, if said from the pulpit or at an election rally. Consider the possible range of the different types of actions. Religious leaders criticizing another religion, telling his people that people of a particular religion should be ostracized. A political leader saying people of a certain religion, race should not have rights in Singapore. These people are not good for Singapore. Throwing a pig's head into a mosque. It happened in Philadelphia 2015. And then the mosque received a voicemail. God is a pig, God is pork. Has happened in regional countries as well, throwing of pigs' heads into mosques. Entertainment which is denigrating and disrespectful of a race or religion. The impact, therefore, will be different depending on who says it and the context. We also consider the occasion, the nature of the event, and the reach. Difference between saying it to 50 people in a private setting compared with publicizing it generally. So, but these factors are not exclusive. So the assessment of the impact is partly subjective based on the nature of the words, the other factors, likely impact on the targeted community. And we also have to accept different religions have entirely different histories, traditions, theologies, and that shapes their outlook even today. And each group reacts differently to different things. So when considering impact, it's not just immediate reaction. The key issues are the security implications of the reaction, and that can be immediate. It could also be longer term by deepening fault lines, creating more tension, and that's the context of the earlier part of my speech. So I don't want to repeat all of that, but as long as you understand this part is fitting in with what I said earlier. So we have to assess. The government is neutral. We proactively accommodate different groups. We recognize their different histories, traditions, and we make practical adjustments. And on that basis, we take a practical approach, assess the impact of reaction of the different communities. So it often involves assessment of potential reaction of the targeted community when we have to decide to allow or ban something. I will also caution we have to assess the impact reaction of the majority in the specific community and the security implications of that opinion, which I've referred to earlier. We have to assess where does the weight of mainstream opinion lie, and we cannot be directed by the viewpoint of a person or persons who are extremely sensitive. Really, the approach has to be guided by common sense. And again, I would like to hear from members. Should we change this approach? There are two possibilities which will allow an absolute objective approach. Ban everything that is deemed insulting or offensive by anyone, or allow everything that is insulting or offensive. And I explained why that will eventually lead to trouble. Members will see that either absolute approach is really not doable. So I think members will probably agree with me that the absolute approach is undesirable. So that brings us back to the pragmatic approach that the government takes as the only tenable one for our society. It can be a bit messy, but it has worked so far with relative success and with a bit of give and take. So how has this approach been applied in practice? Let's look at books. We banned satanic verses in 1989. It's considered a literary work by many. However, every Muslim country banned it, and our mainstream Muslim community took offense. But we have allowed other books, films, even when other religious communities were unhappy, based also on our security assessments. For example, Western traditions accept wider levels of contestation. And Singaporeans, I think, will agree that it's unthinkable to ban a lot of Western literature and philosophy because some may find it objectionable. For instance, would we ban Bertrand Russell's Why Am I Not a Christian because it is critical of the faith? Of course not. Would we proscribe Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire because it had a famous section detailing what he thought were the deleterious effects of Christianity on civilization? Again, we don't ban that. We have to take into account the context. Here, the context of what is acceptable in Western tradition is relevant. We are not as liberal as many Western societies, and our approach differs. But we have allowed some books, movies, performances, and concerts, even though a variety of different religious groups have found them objectionable. So in doing that, we assess the reaction of the community, whether there are immediate security issues, whether there are longer-term security issues by building in deeper fault lines, or whether we think that even though they're unhappy, this is not going to contribute to deepening of fault lines. So reaction of the community itself is part of the mix in assessing the security issues, as I have explained earlier. If you look at our approach to foreign preachers, in 2017, MOM, in consultation with MHA, rejected the applications of 2 foreign Christian preachers to speak in Singapore. One of them, I described Allah as a false god and various other things. The other spoke about the evils of Islam and the malevolent nature of Islam and more things. Then we also banned 2 Muslim preachers. One is Mufti Menk, Zimbabwean Islamic preacher. With your permission, sir, can the video be played? Thank you. There'll be a video of what he says.
Asking us, I want to give a gift to this man and to that man. Can I give a gift? It is the occasion of Christmas. And I want to give a Christmas gift to my friend. And we tell them, my brother and my sister. Let me explain to you logically. You have chosen to be a Muslim. Muslim means one who worships Allah alone and considers association of partnership with Allah as the highest form of blasphemy. Do you understand? So if you're a Muslim, you believe in Allah alone, and any association of partnership with Allah is the highest form of blasphemy. So if it is the highest form of blasphemy, when people have considered someone a son of Allah, and the Quran tells you, تَكَادُ السَّمَاوَاتُ يَتَفَطَّرْنَ Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. The skies are about to rip apart because of the statement that they have uttered. Allahu Akbar. If you look at Surah Maryam, towards the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes mention of a powerful verse. He says, how could they have said that I have a son? And they are insulting Allah by saying that Allah has a son. The earth would like to crumble and the sky would like to split because of the seriousness of that crime. And yet we want to take a gift and say, have a happy day associating partners with Allah. You understand why, as Muslims, it would be wrong for us to take a gift? We are taking a gift and saying, my brother, you have associated partners with Allah. Allah says it is the biggest blasphemy against him, but take this gift, it's okay. From me, I'm a Muslim. Allahu Akbar. Can we understand and realize why we are going wrong? The same would apply if we were to give someone a gift of Diwali or tell them Happy Diwali, for example. What we are actually telling them is, I am really praying that you enjoy your day associating partners with Allah, and this celebration you have of the entire association of the greatest and worst of partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'm telling you, have a happy day, you deserve the enjoyment, and here's my gift. May Allah safeguard us. We would like to present a gift to someone upon their sin and crime.
Very charismatic and powerful, but that is why we banned him. Segregational, divisive. We shouldn't greet someone else. So we have HDB flats. You live next to each other. The Muslim doesn't greet the Christian, and the Christian doesn't greet the Muslim. What happens? Or the Hindu. Second video, again with your permission, sir, Dr. Zakir Nayak, if I can let that be.
Yes, please.
Is it actually forbidden to vote for a non-Muslim?
Nowhere does the Quran say it is forbidden. But if there is a choice, if the two people standing are Muslim and non-Muslim, without doubt, 100% should be Muslim. Because Allah said, Allah is very clear-cut in Surah Ma'idah, chapter 5, verse number 51, that let the believers not take the Jew or the Christian as the awliya. Directly what awliya mean friend, protector or helper. Because they are protectors unto themselves. And anyone who does that becomes one of them. So if you choose a Christian or a Jew, Allah said you will become a Christian or a Jew.
That was said in Indonesia just before the elections for the governor. We have banned him. He has also said Muslims should not take Jews and Christians as protectors or friends. Otherwise, they will become Jews or Christians. Make what you will, both of them are Indians. One is in Zimbabwe and the other is now, I think, in Malaysia. Very eloquent. Thankfully, Singaporeans take a different view. The 2019 IPS study shows that 82% of our people believe that a religious leader should not be influencing people's votes in elections. 82% of Muslims in Singapore also believe that. So foreign preachers, we disallow them even if they may not say something offensive in Singapore. If they have been offensive elsewhere, their offensive teachings are available online. You allow them into Singapore. You then allow them to build up a following in Singapore. So we do not allow them. Because eventually that can become seriously divisive, like not shaking hands, not greeting each other, not voting for candidates of another race or religion. Sometimes we won't know everything that a preacher has said elsewhere, and sometimes we have to make a judgment on the degree to which what he has said elsewhere is offensive. Now let me turn to how we have dealt with preachers in Singapore. 2017, a preacher in a local mosque, Imam Nalla, recited a supplication that called for God to grant victory, some people say it's help, over Jews and Christians during Friday prayers. This passage is not in the Quran. A video of his supplication went online. Imam Nalla was charged. He was fined $4,000. He was on a work pass, and he was asked to leave. Why did we take this step? I explained it in Parliament. Charging a cleric is a serious step. On the other hand, I was concerned again about the normalizing effect of such a sermon. If we allow an imam to exhort victory against Christians, can we prevent Christian preachers from saying similar things about Muslims or followers of other religions, or taking some passages in the Old Testament out of context? What will then be the consequence if this becomes a regular occurrence in religious sermons of the different faiths? These things have a momentum, action, reaction. Let's say we have this on a regular basis. What do you think the atmosphere will be like in our common meeting places? So the imam was charged, a line was drawn, he apologized to the Christian leaders and the rabbi of Singapore. And to show that this was a matter of principle and that we accepted the imam meant no actual ill will or malice, I met him openly in a mosque after his conviction, had breakfast with him before he was asked to leave Singapore. But the principle was established. In 2010, we had a Christian pastor insulting, trivializing, ridiculing beliefs of Buddhists and Taoists, a gentleman by the name of Ronnie Tan, recorded on video, uploaded. ISD spoke with him. He apologized. 2010, another Christian pastor, Mark Ng, denigrating Taoist beliefs. Praying to Taoist deities is like seeking protection from secret society gangsters. ISD spoke with him. He and his church apologized. Mr. Speaker, I repeat, this government makes no apologies for zero tolerance of bigotry. So should the government take a hands-off approach? Some people have argued Singapore is secular. So we should not be banning material that is offensive to Christians, offensive to others, because we are a secular government. Why are we intervening? Leave it to people. Let me respond by referring to the French example. France has this ideology. The state will not intervene in religious matters because it is secular. They term it laïcité. French secularity means the people can publish material that is offensive to any religion. If you look at tab 8, you will see a series of cartoons published by Charlie Hebdo. They're also on the screen. Cartoons on the Trinity, cartoons of the Pope holding a condom like a sacrament, and the various other cartoons. In fact, to just give you a sense, when we talk about, in broad terms, about free speech, people get into, don't really understand sometimes what they are talking about. These cartoons bring right down to the brass tacks what we are talking about, and whether you think free speech should extend to this sort of speech. The Catholics were deeply unhappy. They brought lawsuits. ISIS didn't sue, They used it as an excuse to attack Charlie Hebdo in the name of Islam. No excuse for what ISIS did, but after the Charlie Hebdo attack, Bilahari, our then ambassador at large, gave a speech. He said that the French state had hobbled itself by its own absolutist beliefs. He said the state should be able to stop such publications. The EU and the French ambassadors responded. They wrote to the Straits Times forum pages. They said Europe did impose some constraints against the abuse of freedom of speech, especially against anti-Semitic speech. Bilahari responded, pointed out the double standards. They protect one group, the Jews, while standing by the vilification of another religion, Islam, in the name of free speech. In fact, one can add in the vilification of the Catholic Church as well. Essentially, the French position is the right of anyone to vilify a religion is absolute. I think you can legitimately ask, why should that right to publish override the right of a religious group not to have its texts, beliefs, practices ridiculed? And what about the obligations of citizens to preserve harmony, unity? Don't citizens have such obligations? And if free speech is really absolute, then why prevent anti-Semitic speech? Should we adopt the same secular approach that France takes? Take a hands-off approach, allow these cartoons, offensive material, ridicule, hate speech directed at any race or religion? This secular government is completely neutral. It does not privilege any religious group, nor does it allow any religious group to be insulted and attacked. This secular government guarantees freedom of religion. It protects all, including minorities, from threats and violence. It works closely with IROs, IRCCs, religious leaders to ensure a common understanding of what binds us as Singaporeans, that we all work towards religious harmony. That is the fundamental assurance one gets in Singapore. Doesn't matter who you are, what religion you believe in. You are free to believe in any religion, including not to believe. You and members of your faith will be protected from hate speech, unacceptable, offensive speech. The state will strive in every way possible to achieve racial, religious harmony. That is the secularity we adopt. That is different from saying government should take a hands-off approach in the name of secularity, allow people to spread hate speech, promote violence. The French approach is illustrative of another interesting point. It is guided by a dark history that the rest of Europe shares. Specifically, the anti-Semitism, which led to the Holocaust, and the complicity of almost all European countries in the persecution of Jews during the Second World War. Thus, in some European countries, it is an offense to even deny the Holocaust. It includes Austria, Belgium, Czech Republic, France, Germany, Luxembourg, Poland, Romania, Slovakia. But really, does one have to wait until a Holocaust type of nightmare against a particular group before you act against hate speech? Not for us to say the French or European approaches are right or wrong. Europe has a long tradition, a proud heritage, but our experience of nationhood, the value system of our respective cultural traditions, convinces us the European approach will not work for us. Now, Europe is grappling with other issues: immigration, multiculturalism. Anti-Semitism is again on the rise in Europe. Extreme right-wing populist movements, in some cases neo-fascists, are rising across Europe. Obviously, the liberal values of racial and religious tolerance are not shared by a fairly significant number of Europeans at this point in time. Tolerance of hate speech does not breed tolerance of difference. We have to decide what works for us. Singapore is only 54 years old this year. Racial religious tolerance is slowly being rejected in older societies than ours, which claim to be liberal. Prudent for us not to take Singapore's values, unique and new in history, for granted. You look at our history, our fault lines. The 2016 CNA IPS survey on race relations, it's tab 9, and it's also on the screen. 63% of Malays and 62% of Indians and 72% of others thought that there was a majority Chinese privilege. Even nearly 50% of Chinese thought there was such privilege. If you look at another table in the same tab, 40% of minorities felt that majority race was demanding for more rights. If you look at relevance of policies, thankfully, most of our citizens felt that our existing legislation, Racial Harmony Day, Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, were very good things to have. If you look at racism as a persisting concern, nearly half of the respondents acknowledge the persistence of racism as a problem. Even Chinese, when you ask about their friends, they say 42% are either mildly racist or racist. Openness to race discussion. 2/3 felt that discussions on race were disconcerting because it could be offensive and lead to tension. So you can see we have done well, but the fault lines remain and they run deep and they can be exploited. When 2/3 of Singaporeans believe that mere talking about racial tension or racial issues causes tension, what do you think about offensive speech? Studies have shown we react differently to people from different races. Human brain fires differently when dealing with people outside of one's own race. And I'm quoting a study on that. We are more likely to trust those from the same race. And I quote, "Shutting our eyes to the complexities of race does not make them disappear, but does make it harder to see that color blindness often creates more problems than it solves." You look at the former Yugoslavia. Muslims, Christians lived side by side for nearly 500 years, and not just 54 years. Substantially similar genetic makeup, shared history. When Yugoslavia broke up, genocide and atrocities. Let me now turn to the Christchurch shooting. It just suffered its worst ever mass shooting. Right-wing terrorist acting out his hate-filled ideology wanted to create fear among the Muslim community in New Zealand. Response of the New Zealand Prime Minister and the people of New Zealand has been quite amazing, and there is much for us to learn from them. The Prime Minister embraced the Muslim community, showed that she is sincerely shared in their pain and loss. And the people of New Zealand have displayed great strength and resilience. They have shown the world how to respond to a terrorist attack, not with hate, but with rejection of the message of the terrorist. In Singapore, we have been building up our resilience of our citizens through the SG Secure movement. We don't have the history that New Zealand does, and our population is much more diverse. Nevertheless, I can only hope that as a nation, we can respond in the same way in the face of terror. New Zealand has a small Muslim population compared with us, relatively. New Zealand police have in recent years taken steps to understand and engage their Muslim community. They have even employed a number of our officers for this purpose, including 2 Muslim officers from the Security Command who have relocated there. Let me now turn to the Watain concert. The lyrics and the beliefs of the band denigrate Christianity. Seriously offensive. Their own fans acknowledge this. Natural, therefore, for Christians to take offense. IMDA received the application from the organizer in the end of December 2018. MHA was then informed of the application. After considering, MHA initially told IMDA that MHA objected to the concert. IMDA then requested a reconsideration of MHA's position. IMDA also proposed that its detailed licensing conditions and requirements for the concert for MHA's consideration. Restrictions are quite substantive. Concert would be classified R18, removal of songs that may be potentially sensitive, no religious symbols used during the concert, no reference to religion in the band's on-stage dialogue. Content should not derogate any faith or promote any cult practice, nor advocate or promote violence in any way. No ritualistic or satanic acts, and a number of other conditions. MHA then informed IMDA that while it was still concerned, it will leave it to IMDA to decide on issuing such a restricted license. That restricted license was issued on the 5th of March. On the 7th of March, MHA asked IMDA to consider canceling the concert 2 days later, and IMDA canceled the license in view of MHA's serious concerns. The initial assessment was that if the band did not perform offensively in Singapore, that should be acceptable. 2 days before the concert, MHA received reports of mainstream Christians being very concerned, offended. My officers met with Christian leaders, leaders of other religions. Our MPs gave feedback, both Christian and non-Christian MPs, many others. Given that many Christians felt this was deeply offensive and denigrating, MHA advised IMDA to cancel. It was my decision that MHA should so advise IMDA. My officers and I take into account both the reaction of the Christian community and, as I explained earlier, it's not just the reaction of the community, but the broader security implications of that reaction, both immediate and the medium and longer term consequences. It was a judgment call. The ban comes from a largely Christian country. 67% of Swedes belong to the Church of Sweden. With the restrictions imposed, we assessed that the concert should be all right. Our assessment was, however, different from what actually transpired. So when you make assessments, sometimes the reality will turn out to be different. Why were the Christians offended such that they did not want Watain to perform in Singapore under any condition? Because of what Watain stood for, its philosophy. And you need to understand a little bit about Watain. The front man of Watain, Eric Danielson, has said this about his creation. I'm not going to read it in detail. It's in tab 10 in your tabs, and it will also be flashed on screen. But he said it's a potential to attract fanatical people. He accepts. He says that they do promote lawlessness, violence, crime, madness, all hopefully for the love of the devil and the primal urge to express it. He says we are not talking about ethics and morals. We talk about where no laws exist and no morals exist. His views on Christians, all our enemies are Christian sheep who we go about doing our thing, pissing in their living rooms. Music does have the potential to make people do bad things. He was asked whether he feared that he would be misunderstood and that someone might go and start shooting in a mall. And he said that wouldn't be a misunderstanding. I totally encourage any kind of terrorist acts committed in the name of Watain. Absolutely. That's the way it works. The interviewer then repeated the question just to be sure, and he doubled down. We have always been encouraging music to take a physical form. When churches were burned, to me it's a very natural consequences of being the devil's music. What matters is the effect this has. The effect of those church burnings had on the people who were terrible. They were, you see, fall at a word, afraid. They were shitting in their pants because, according to the media, there was a bunch of Satanists burning down churches and murdering people. It's like holding your hand, iron grip that takes hold around people's throats. That's what was important about the church burnings. More important than any time than a church is set on fire. And he said there is never a line that we have been afraid to cross. You can read the quotes in detail, which we have. I've asked for the quotes to be circulated because there are people who said context is important, and I agree. That is why I've set out the context as provided by the band itself. The band's lyrics are also denigrating, and they are in tab 11. I'm not going to go into them, but you can read it. You can read them. So members may then ask, given all this, why did we in the first place allow the band to perform or give permission for the band to perform? As I said earlier, we thought that if we told them you will not play any lyrics that are offensive to Christians and imposed other conditions, and there were going to be about 200 people there, that would strike an appropriate balance. But church leaders we spoke with, others, understood our rationale. They nevertheless felt that we should not allow this particular performance. So when we concluded that this was the mainstream view, widespread, and assessed the consequent security issues, we decided the concert had to be cancelled. Our assessment of public sentiment turned out to be correct, because a subsequent survey showed, first of all, that 60% were aware of the cancellation. Of those who are aware, 86% of Christians agreed with the cancellation. That, I think, may be natural. But 64% of all those who had heard about the cancellation, Christian and non-Christian, also agreed with the cancellation. 28% thought that it should not have been cancelled. Buddhist Muslims, nearly 70% agreed. Free thinkers, less so, 44%. I recognize some Singaporeans disagree with the government. Example, Ms. Chu Wai Shan. She set out her views quite articulately, a former teacher, in a post. There were others as well. Essentially, their point is the government is being self-righteous in trying to govern other people's lives and decisions. Audience can listen to metal music without being influenced by a band's beliefs. NCCS and churches can advise their members not to go to the concert. No need for a ban. Seen in isolation, these are valid points. The argument in essence is, why should I not listen to what I want to? Why should you, the government or the church, tell me what I can listen to and what I cannot listen to? The reality, however, as we have seen, is not so simple. The larger picture, it is not about whether the government should tell you what music you can or cannot listen to. You can listen to Watain concerts, for example, on Spotify, at least as of now. The issue here is about whether the government should give Watain license to perform publicly in Singapore. And the government has responsibility not just to the individuals who like the music, but also the majority of Singaporeans who would be offended. And it's not just one Watain concert. If we allow this concert, we will have to allow other such concerts. Then what about other performance arts? What about drama? What about visual performances? We must allow similar hate and offensive speech. And I think if you see the lyrics and what they say, it goes well into the territory of hate speech. We must allow on the principle of fairness. Then what about political and religious discourse? Logically, we should allow based on the same reasoning. But assume for the time being we can draw some line that says no to political and religious discourse, but only in music and entertainment. You will still then have a lot of hate speech in the mainstream through entertainment. The question then would be, do you agree with the evidence that hate speech, hate music can cause deep splits, divisions within society, that it can normalize hateful sentiments, allow discrimination? Would those people who are unhappy with the ban of Watain be willing to accept the following consequences of their position? Will they accept that over time, the fault lines of race and religion will be greater? I've shown you the research. Do they accept that hate speech then will become normalized? And do they also accept the consequences of that? Then they are being honest. If they say, yes, I accept all of this, I still think we should have absolute freedom of speech. We should have the freedom to have hate speech through entertainment in Singapore, regardless of the consequences. If they are willing to say, I accept that similar concerts, entertainment, attacking Islam, Buddhism, other religions should also be allowed. They have to say that. You can't say, I will only accept it in respect of one religion. And if we allowed Watain, do we also allow Malay power music? Members will recall what I said earlier. These bans call for an end of immigration to Malaysia and for non-Malays to be expelled from the country. And they say they draw their inspiration from Nazi Germany. Because if we allowed Watain, what grounds would we have to ban other groups with similar messages? And then do we allow Chinese power music as well? Where do you draw the line? It doesn't exist now. But if Malay power is allowed to thrive, you are sure we won't have Chinese power music as well? And why not go further? If we can allow Watain and the lyrics and their philosophy, should we not allow the kinds of cartoons that Charlie Hebdo has published? They were so repulsive that when we first wanted to distribute, the parliamentary secretariat said this is too offensive to distribute in Parliament. And I said that's the very purpose, to bring across to people, in reality, what it is that we are talking about. Should we agree to the mass media reprinting the Danish cartoons? Consider the Danish experience. In 2005, a Danish publication ran 12 editorial cartoons under the title The Face of Muhammad. One depicted the Prophet with a bomb in his turban. Another showed him in heaven telling suicide bombers that heaven had run out of virgins. Ambassadors from Muslim countries petitioned the Danish government to condemn the cartoons and punish the responsible parties. The government said it had no right to interfere with the freedom of the press. A year later, the Danish and Norwegian embassies in Syria were set on fire. A mob burned down the Danish embassy in Lebanon. What do you think will be the consequences if we allowed the same within Singapore? Or what do you think our Muslim population will think? Will it unite us or divide us? What do you think will be the consequences for us within the region towards Singaporeans and Singapore? I hope members, when they speak, will not flinch from these questions and run into generalities on free speech. You've got to ask in brass tacks, what do you mean? What should be the restrictions? Should we restrict these things? Should we not? If we don't, are we prepared for the consequences? If you honestly say, yes, we accept all these possible consequences, that will be an honest statement. But if you put it in these terms, and that you accept these consequences, you will be in a small minority. I don't think many Singaporeans will support such a position. Let me explain by reference to some surveys again. 2013 IPS survey, 93% of Malays said race was important to identity. This is in tab 12 of the tabs. 85% of Chinese and Indians said the same. 97% of Muslims said religion was important for identity. 91.4% of Christians said that, and 89.5% of Catholics said the same. 85% of the respondents said a report should be made, a police report should be made when someone pokes fun at racial, religious groups. 87% of respondents said a report should be made when someone insults another racial or religious group in a public setting. 86% of respondents said a report should be made when there is material criticizing other religions or racial beliefs. If you look at tab 14, the latest IPS survey, which came out just a few days ago, 28th of March, it talks about religion in Singapore, private and public spheres. 65% of Singaporeans identified themselves as at least somewhat religious. 42% said they prayed at least once a day. Now, that's a very high level of religiosity. It ranged from 31% to 77%. 87% of Muslims and Christians read religious scripts outside of a worship service. 88% had at least some confidence in Parliament. I think that shows that the public generally believes in Parliament, and the legislative process has generally been fair, certainly with respect to religion and race. 77% said religious extremists should not be allowed to hold public meetings to express their views. 73% said religious extremists should not be allowed to publish their views online. But I should add, the younger respondents, 45% of those between 18 and 25, were more open to such views being published online. That is one reason, another reason why we should have this discussion here and a broader discussion outside. I think the younger generation also needs to understand what is it that they are saying yes to and what the consequences are. 97% said a religious leader should not make insensitive comments about another's religion, and 95% said religious leaders should not encourage followers not to mix with members of another religion. 88% thought a religious leader should not even point out flaws in another religion to the congregants, even behind closed doors. That is our society. It is religious, but Singaporeans believe in giving everyone their own religious space. They frown upon conflicts, do not approve of offensive religious speech and insults. They believe the police should act when there are insults or criticisms directed at another religion, let alone hate or offensive speech. These views have been molded by our own experiences and our understanding of why we have racial religious harmony in Singapore. It shows the support of Singaporeans for the approach we have taken so far. Now, some commentators online have also said dark suggestions of a Christian conspiracy. They have a hold on government. Government bowed to their power, overrepresentation of Christians in institutions of power. They try to turn it into a Christian versus others debate. I say nasty, opportunistic, and dangerous. These people are nasty, opportunistic, and dangerous. I made the decision in my capacity as Minister for Home Affairs, enshrined with the responsibility of guarding national security and religious harmony. No one, Christian or otherwise, influenced me. I'm not a Christian. I also decided to ban 2 Christian preachers in 2017. So what does one make of that? Mr. Speaker, so long as a government believes in the principles that I have set out in this House, and such a government is in charge, no matter who the Minister for Home Affairs is, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, or agnostic, that government would make such decisions on the basis of national interest. Having initially made the decision to allow the concert, we had new information on how the community was reacting. What do? If we were only interested in tactical considerations, we would have let the concert proceed. But that is not the right thing to do. The right thing, more difficult to do, is to cancel and explain to the public why we canceled. But I should caution at the same time, it is not possible for the government to accept any community's viewpoint on all issues, on every performer, for every concert, in every art form. We will give due consideration to the views of all communities, but ultimately government will have to decide based on the principles I have set out. I have no doubt we will have to make many more such pragmatic decisions on concerts, books, materials, which some will consider irreverent or even derogatory of religion. We can't and won't ban everything, however slight the offense. But government will be fair, it will be even-handed, and it has to be practical. But I reiterate, where hate speech is concerned, where offensive speech is concerned, where vast numbers of any community finds it deeply wounding, we will not hesitate to take action. The Reach survey that I cited earlier shows a majority agreed with the government's cancellation of the Watain concert. But let's ask ourselves, what if the majority did not feel that something deeply offensive to a minority community should be banned? Should we therefore allow such an event? The majority of Germans in the 1930s may not have objected to vile anti-Semitism of the Nazis, but that does not mean the majority view was correct. I hope we would always have a government that insists on doing the right thing to protect any community in Singapore, no matter how small, no matter what the majority might feel. Let me now turn finally to the role of social media. Social media has fundamentally changed the complexion of public discourse. Hate speech, offensive speech travels much faster, gains wider audience than before. I had earlier quoted a study in Germany. What was telling about that study is that when there were internet outages or service disruptions to Facebook, incidents of anti-immigrant violence dipped in the very places where they were high. Social media platforms have shown themselves to be unable, unwilling to deal with hate and offensive speech. They have not taken real responsibility for the content circulating on their platforms. They earn money by advertising. The more eyeballs, the better. Using algorithms, they can deliver news reports that are likely to elicit outrage and responses. I have put in tab 14 some fairly offensive pictures. They're also on screen. White women being violated by immigrants. Someone is killing her child meanwhile. Twitter refused to take it down, not in breach of Twitter's hateful conduct policy. In the case of the Christchurch shootings, Facebook failed to quickly shut down and remove the live stream video from its platform. Video was viewed 4,000 times before it was taken down. But that's a small number compared to the circulation on WhatsApp. And Facebook will tell you it cannot do anything about that because of encryption. I think the Prime Minister of New Zealand put it well when she's called for social media companies to take responsibility for contents they published. It cannot be a case of all profits and no responsibility, she said. The Australian Prime Minister has talked about imposing criminal charges on social media companies that are not responsible. Mr. Speaker, I drafted the speech before Mr. Zuckerberg's latest statement. That obviously has to be studied carefully. Prior to the shootings in Christchurch, it was said that white racialist hate speech cannot be taken down, should not be taken down. In a few days, that position seems to have changed. We will need to deal with this. The bill that has been tabled on online falsehoods is one step. We will have to consider what else. Let me now conclude, Mr. Speaker, sir, by saying the following. Our approach to race and religion has largely been successful. The lived reality of Singaporeans is the test. In a Gallup World Poll in 2016, Singapore ranked top out of 140 countries for tolerance of ethnic minorities. In 2016, the CNA IPS survey on race relations, which I referred to earlier, respondents strongly endorsed issues relating to multiculturalism. 96% agreed or strongly agreed with the statement, I have respect for people from all races. And President Obama said this in 2015 about Singapore. And one of the reasons why Singapore has been so successful is because we, and I quote, have been able to bring together people who may look different, but they all think of themselves as part of Singapore. He said there has to be strength. That has to be a strength, not a weakness. But that requires leadership and a government being true to those principles. I started this speech by referring to 4 events in 4 countries and asked if there might be a larger picture. What is the larger picture? If you look at tab 15, my speech has attempted to sketch that picture. On the spectrum of race and religious relations, we are in the positive part of the spectrum because of the way we have structured our legal, social framework and all the things we have done to maintain racial, religious harmony. What has been happening in Iraq and Syria is an illustration of what can happen when things go badly, not just in terms of race and religion, but other things go badly. So they are in the deeply negative part of the spectrum. New Zealand represents a warning and alert to us. Even a country which can fairly be described as heaven on earth can suffer a serious attack. It shows how hate speech can fuel crazy people. And what happened in New Zealand can happen elsewhere. So New Zealand is positive on the spectrum, but uninhibited hate speech can have terrible consequences. Netherlands, Utrecht, problems that extremism poses, even in advanced, prosperous societies, is shown up by that attack. Integration issues in Europe, so it's a flashing amber light. And German Chancellor Angela Merkel has said the multicultural concept is a failure, an absolute failure. She's talking about Europe. We don't want that in Singapore. Former British Prime Minister David Cameron said, "We have failed to provide a vision of society to which different cultures feel that they want to belong. We have even tolerated these segregated communities behaving in a way that runs counter to our values. For us, cancelling of Watain is one discrete step. Why we did that can only be understood by understanding the larger picture of why we are in the positive part of the spectrum. And that is why we are different from so many others. Our current racial and religious harmony didn't fall ready-made from the sky. It is not part of the natural order of things. There is nothing natural about it. We engineered this over many decades. People accuse us of social engineering. So what, I ask? We imposed ethnic quotas in housing to prevent racial enclaves in our housing estates and possible ghettos, banlieues, as they are called in France. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right. We have GRCs to ensure minority representation in Parliament. Look around this House. Could we have guaranteed this number of Malay Indian members if not for GRCs? We have the Presidential Council for Minority Rights. Checks that bills passed by Parliament do not discriminate against any racial or religious community. We have protection of minorities written into the Constitution. We have the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act. Everyone knows in Singapore, we will have no hesitation arresting any bigot of whatever persuasion. Anyone burns the Bible or Quran or any holy book in the name of freedom of speech, ISD will deal with him. We long ago stopped Christian preachers from evangelizing insensitively amongst Muslims. We have had a recent case in Clementi of an attempt to evangelize to Muslim boys, and police are investigating. We have the current harmony because we did all this, not despite, but because. We took no chances. We brooked no agitation on race and religion. We refused to let the state bow to any religious or racial group, minority or majority. In Singapore, we organize ourselves horizontally. All races and religions are treated equally on the same level. Most other countries in Asia, if not all, either explicitly or implicitly organize themselves vertically on the basis of ethnic, religious hierarchy, including a liberal democracy like Japan. Our uniqueness in this respect should not be underestimated. Equality of races and religions is not the natural order of things. It has to be defended. On the very first day of our existence as a sovereign, independent state, the founding Prime Minister said, "This will not be a Chinese nation, not a Malay nation, not an Indian nation." From the beginning, the government determined it will base its legitimacy by appealing to all Singaporeans, not just the majority Chinese. That determination to be multiracial, multi-religious, that determination that no one will be squatted upon on account of his race or religion, the color of his skin, or the language he speaks, that's why we became independent, and we mean to keep it that way. If anything, we are prepared to err on the side of caution and risk overreacting to preserve harmony rather than take chances and risk explosions. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, reflecting back in a New York Times interview, said in 2010, "I've got to tell the next generation, please do not take for granted what's been built. I believe our younger generation has come to believe that this is a natural state of affairs. They think you can put it on autopilot. I know that this is never so. Let us heed his warning. What we have in Singapore is precious, hard-fought, but we are only 54 years old. A multiracial meritocracy, unique, but the values are not yet so deeply embedded to be unassailable. Mr. Speaker, I invite members to consider the questions I have raised, and just in case they have not taken it down, the list of questions are also in the tab, so that you can refer to it as you speak. So I beg to move that the ministerial statement made by me on restricting hate speech to maintain racial and religious harmony in Singapore be considered by Parliament. Thank you, sir.